The other day, I was cleaning out my grandfather's attic when I came across a letter dating back to 1974. Apparently, he was working on a case similar to the Black Diala case. The letter reads the following: I have a confession to make. You see, 3 years ago, I was involved in the homicide investigation of Elijah Parks. The sky was shrouded in a dark layer of clouds that seemed to be looking over our shoulders. The body was fresh, long cuts around the upper torso. The arms and legs were missing, leaving only the dried bloody stumps in their place. Damn it, I said softly. My partner, looking over the dismembered body of the victim, casually took out his lighter and lit a cigarette. This is the third time this month, Jack, he said, inhaling half of his cancer stick before flicking the ash to the ground. I knelt down, examining the body. Yeah, same MO as the last time. I let out a frustrating sigh. Bruising around the neck, the letter R carved into the victim's stomach. The reproductive organs sewn together and cauterized. My partner walked over, then bent down to get a better look at the wounds. If the records are the same, then that would have been done before death. We went back to the station earlier that day. We had a few people come in that knew the victims. One, a tall, long, blonded woman by the name of Kelsey, sat at a table with a cup of coffee in her hand, her eyes wide, and by the looks of her, you would have thought she hadn't slept in days. Mrs. Kowalski, I said as my partner and I stepped through the door, closing it behind us. Yes? She looked up at us, a fear in her eyes that seemed to speak for itself. You're here on behalf of Elijah Parks, is that correct? I said, reaching in my coat for a pen and paper. Yeah, I was with Elijah a couple of nights ago. Her voice was shaky and her eyes was fixated on the coffee in her hands. I looked at my partner and proceeded to lean forward with the pen in the hand. You were with Mrs. Parks a couple of nights ago? Can you recall the time and day? Her eyes were non-blinking, a stare that seemed to stretch out for miles. Thursday, around 10 at night. I cleared my throat and began to speak, but before I could, she continued. We were out drinking, a girls' night out. Can I have a cigarette? She asked, her eyes breaking away from the cup. My partner reluctantly gave her one and offered her a light. Thank you, officer, she said, clearing her throat. Elijah had just gotten out of a heated relationship with her ex. I thought she could relax, and so we went out. I told her she should come and spend a few nights with me, or until she got back on her feet. The room grew silent for a moment. The weight of everything seemed to make the air heavy. After a few drinks, she told me that she would just have to figure it out. Her sister lived a few blocks up from the bar, just past the Johnsbrook Elementary School. I nodded, writing everything down as she spoke. Did she decide to walk there after you girls had your drinks? My partner chimed in, leaning against the wall of the room. Yeah, I called a cab to come pick me afterwards. Then, after that, I hadn't seen her since. Her cigarette had come down to the filter. She hadn't taken but one draw of it. Okay. Thank you, Mrs. Kowalski. This information will help with the ongoing investigation. We shook hands and I went outside and pulled a pack of smokes from my coat. I didn't smoke. Well, not anymore. I used to, until I stopped a few years back. I put the butt of my cigarette in my mouth and I started to think about the recent murders. What type of insane lunatic were we dealing with? My partner came up to me, lighting one for himself before offering me a light. Need a light, Jack? He asked. I shook my hand, declining the offer. I'm good, thanks, Paul. He cocked his head to the side, looking at me with what I would assume to be a look of confusion. Why not just light it? Why just leave it there? I took his lighter and grabbed the cigarette out of my mouth and looked at it. There is a certain thing about having something that you know that will kill you, but giving it the power. I flicked the lighter, causing the dancing flame to raise up from its cold metal prison, causing it to move freely back and forth. But giving it power to kill, gives it a whole other meaning. Paul laughed, shaking his head. Jesus, Jack, that's the most beautiful shit I think I ever heard you say this past month, he said in a sarcastic tone. You thinking about becoming the next Robert Frost? He jested. I held the cigarette out, examining it. Yeah, I think I just might. I put the cigarette back in my coat and pulled my keys out. We should follow up on that leak before it gets cold. Paul jumped in the passenger seat of my car. You drive, he called out. I jumped in the driver's seat and we started to make our way to Elijah's sister's place. It took about 20 minutes to get from the station to the girl's house. From what I can recall back then, after a few officers delivered the news to the girl, she took the loss of her sister relatively hard, as any good sibling would. I knocked on the door and after a few minutes of waiting, I turned and looked to Paul, who was waiting as well. You sure this is the place? He said. Yeah, records show this is the spot. I tried the doorknob. I looked at my partner and nodded. It's unlocked, I said, whispering. We unholstered our weapons and entered the home. The house was silent. You could easily hear a pen drop. Paul looked at me as we cleared the living room and into the kitchen. I got you covered, he said, as the sound of creaking came from one of the rooms down the hall. We exchanged glances. LAPD, I called out, reaching the room at the end we prepared to enter, unknowing what would await us on the other side. The smell hit us first. It was pungent. The blood-stained sheet lay on the ground, covering something underneath. Call it in, I told Paul. He left as I knelt down to uncover whatever was left for us to discover. A set of arms and legs lay before me. Jesus, I refrained from vomiting as I draped back the sheets over the limbs. Paul came running back in. Backup's on the way, he said, covering his nose. Is that the sister? It's hard to say. We won't know until the coroners show up. An hour had passed as we taped the place up as an active crime scene. A car pulled up. A dark-haired woman got out and approached the police line. Officers! She yelled. I approached the woman, pulling out my pen and paper. Yes, ma'am. She looked over my shoulder at the house, which was a max capacity with LA's finest. Respectfully, officer, can I ask why the hell you guys are closing off my house? Part of the letter is torn off. I can't really tell you what else is wrote here, but I know it's awful. It is to pause a story, but my grandfather's letter stops there. So I'm going to see if I can dig up any information